Sometimes the safest place in a crowded room is the one place no one thinks to look. Naomi Brooks did not plan to spend her Friday night hiding under a restaurant table, but as the sound of the front door swung open behind her and a familiar voice carried across the polished marble floor, instinct moved faster than reason. Morello's Italian restaurant was the kind of place where everything shined. Crystal glasses reflected the warm amber light from hanging chandeliers, the mahogany bar stretched along the far wall like a polished mirror, and soft piano music floated through the air as guests in tailored jackets and elegant dresses enjoyed late dinners. Naomi had worked there for 8 months, long enough to memorize the rhythm of the place, the quiet clink of silverware, the soft hum of conversation, the scent of garlic butter and fresh basil drifting from the kitchen. It was usually safe. Predictable. But the moment she heard that voice, every sense in her body sharpened. Ryan Hale had just walked in. Naomi froze behind the service station, her hand still gripping a linen napkin she had been folding seconds earlier. Across the dining room she could see him scanning the tables, shoulders stiff, eyes searching. Ryan looked exactly the same as the last time she had seen him months ago, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the same dark leather jacket that once made him seem confident and charming. Now it only made Naomi's stomach tighten. She knew that look in his eyes. He wasn't here for dinner. He was here for her. Naomi turned quickly, heart racing, and moved through the narrow aisle between tables as quietly as possible. The manager was busy speaking with a group near the bar and none of the other servers noticed the tension tightening in her shoulders. For a moment she considered heading toward the kitchen, but Ryan was already moving deeper into the restaurant, his gaze sweeping across the room like someone checking every corner. The distance between them was shrinking. Naomi spotted the VIP section ahead, separated from the rest of the dining room by a low velvet rope and a row of tall green plants. Normally servers only approached those tables when specifically assigned, but right now it looked like the only place she might disappear. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she slipped past the rope and stepped toward the nearest table. It was large, round, covered with a white linen cloth that nearly brushed the floor. Without thinking, Naomi crouched and lifted the edge of the cloth, sliding underneath just as Ryan's voice echoed across the room again. The world suddenly became quiet beneath the table. From down there, she could see only polished black shoes, chair legs, and the faint reflection of chandelier light on the marble floor. Her breathing was shallow, careful. For a second, she allowed herself to believe she might actually stay hidden. Then a calm voice above her spoke. "You know this is usually where people put their feet, not themselves." Naomi's head snapped upward. She hadn't realized anyone was sitting there. Slowly, cautiously, she looked up past the edge of the tablecloth. The man seated above her was watching with quiet curiosity, his posture relaxed, one hand resting beside a glass of sparkling water. He was probably in his mid-30s, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that suggested quiet wealth rather than flashy style. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and his expression was composed in a way that made the busy restaurant around him seem suddenly distant. Naomi swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, don't tell him I'm here." The man studied her for a moment, not with suspicion, but with a calm attention that made her even more aware of how unusual the situation must look. Beneath the tablecloth the world felt strangely small, as if the entire restaurant had shrunk to the few square feet around them. From the dining room, Naomi could still hear Ryan moving between tables, his footsteps stopping occasionally as he spoke to staff or guests. Each pause made her heart jump. Above her, the man leaned back slightly in his chair, glancing toward the direction of the voice searching the room. When he looked back down at Naomi, there was the faintest trace of curiosity in his eyes. "Who exactly," he asked quietly, "are you hiding from?" Naomi opened her mouth to answer, but at that moment Ryan's footsteps moved closer, and the man above her lifted the edge of the tablecloth, just enough to look toward the aisle. Naomi followed his gaze and realized something she hadn't noticed when she first ran. The table she had chosen wasn't just any table in the VIP section. It was the center table. The one reserved for the most important guest in the room. And the man whose calm voice had just asked her that question was not simply a diner enjoying a quiet meal. He was Victor Castellano. Naomi Brooks had learned a long time ago that the difference between a peaceful night and a terrifying one could be measured in seconds, and as she crouched beneath the linen tablecloth in Morello's VIP section, she felt every one of those seconds stretching painfully slow while the restaurant around her continued its elegant routine as if nothing unusual was happening. Silverware touched porcelain plates, quiet laughter drifted across the room, and the piano player near the bar moved smoothly from one soft jazz melody to another while guests remained unaware that a frightened waitress was hidden only a few feet away beneath one of the most exclusive tables in the building. Naomi kept her breathing shallow as she listened to the sound of footsteps moving between the dining tables because she knew Ryan Hale well enough to recognize the determined rhythm of his walk, the kind of steady stride that meant he had not come to leave quickly. Months earlier Naomi had promised herself she would never let him corner her again. Yet the moment she had heard his voice at the front entrance her body had reacted before her thoughts could catch up, carrying her straight into the one place she had never expected to hide. Above her Victor Castellano remained seated with the same calm posture he had held since she first looked up at him, his presence strangely steady compared to the tension tightening Naomi's chest. She had heard the name Castellano before even if she had never met him in person. Because in a city like New York certain names moved quietly through conversations the way shadows moved across the skyline, and Victor Castellano was one of those names that people spoke carefully, usually followed by respectful silence. Naomi lowered her voice again, barely louder than the soft music drifting through the restaurant, and whispered that the man looking for her had no reason to be here except to cause trouble. But before she could explain more, the footsteps in the dining room slowed near the VIP rope and Ryan's voice rose clearly across the polished marble floor as he asked one of the servers if they had seen a woman with dark hair wearing a black apron. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second because she knew that description fit her perfectly, and she imagined the nervous glance that server would probably give toward the kitchen entrance before shrugging in uncertainty. The tablecloth shifted slightly as Victor leaned back just enough to observe the dining room beyond the edge of the linen fabric, and Naomi noticed that his movements were careful and controlled as if he had spent years practicing how to watch a room without drawing attention to himself. The calm way he studied the situation made her realize that he was not surprised by unexpected events, and the realization only made her more aware of how unusual it must appear for a restaurant waitress to be hiding beneath his table. Ryan's footsteps moved closer again and Naomi could hear the impatience in his voice when he asked another employee the same question, this time louder, causing a few nearby diners to glance up from their meals with mild curiosity. The restaurant manager finally stepped forward with a polite but tense smile, attempting to guide Ryan back toward the entrance while explaining that Morello's was a private dining establishment and guests were expected to remain respectful of the atmosphere. But Ryan was not listening and Naomi could hear the frustration building in his voice as he insisted he only wanted to speak with someone who worked there. Beneath the table Naomi felt the quiet weight of Victor's attention return to her, and when she looked up again she saw that his expression had not changed, though there was now a hint of thoughtful interest in his eyes as if he were measuring the situation carefully before deciding what to do next. Naomi swallowed and told him softly that she would leave the moment the man left the restaurant because she did not want to cause trouble for anyone, especially not for the person whose table she had just turned into an unexpected hiding place. Victor listened without interrupting and then rested one hand lightly against the edge of the table as Ryan's footsteps moved closer to the velvet rope separating the VIP section from the rest of the dining room. The distance between them was now only a few yards, and Naomi could feel the tension rising in the air the same way a storm could be felt before the first drop of rain. Guests near the rope turned their heads as Ryan paused there, scanning the VIP area with narrowed eyes while the manager continued speaking to him in a calm voice that attempted to keep the situation from escalating into a public scene. Naomi held perfectly still beneath the table, aware that even the smallest movement might draw attention, and she wondered how long a person could remain invisible in a crowded room before someone inevitably noticed the silence hiding in plain sight. Above her Victor Castellano remained composed, watching the dining room with the quiet patience of someone who understood exactly how much power could exist in a single moment of stillness. Ryan Hale did not cross the velvet rope immediately, and that small hesitation allowed the quiet tension in Morello's dining room to stretch another fragile moment while the manager continued speaking in a careful voice about reservations, private seating, and respect for other guests. Naomi could not see Ryan's face from beneath the table, but she knew the rhythm of his patience the same way a sailor knows the movement of the tide, and the longer he remained there scanning the room the more certain she became that he would not leave until he felt satisfied. Above her, Victor Castellano rested one elbow lightly against the arm of his chair, his attention moving between the dining room and the frightened waitress beneath his table as if both scenes belonged equally to him, and Naomi sensed that he was the kind of man who preferred understanding a situation completely before choosing a response. The piano melody shifted into a slower tune and the warm amber light from the chandeliers reflected across the polished marble floor, creating the strange illusion that the restaurant had become even calmer while tension quietly tightened inside the room. Naomi pressed her hands together to stop them from shaking and whispered that she was sorry for interrupting his dinner because she had not known anyone was seated there when she ran. And Victor listened with the same composed expression before asking her a single question in a voice so calm it almost blended with the music. He asked how long the man searching for her had been looking. Naomi hesitated for a moment before answering because telling the truth meant admitting that Ryan had been searching for months. Sometimes appearing outside the small apartment building where she lived in Queens, sometimes leaving messages with mutual acquaintances who still believed their relationship had simply ended badly rather than dangerously. She explained that Ryan had once been someone she trusted, someone who could make a crowded room feel comfortable with a single confident smile. But over time his charm had slowly changed into something heavier and harder to escape, the kind of attention that did not accept distance easily. She told Victor that leaving had taken more courage than she expected and that the months afterward had felt like learning how to breathe again, building small routines that made life feel normal, such as late subway rides home after work and quiet mornings at the corner bakery near her apartment. Morello's had become part of that routine, a place where she could focus on memorizing wine lists and dessert specials instead of worrying about the past. The irony was not lost on her that the one night Ryan managed to find her workplace happened to be the same night she chose the wrong table to hide beneath. Victor listened without interrupting, his gaze thoughtful as he watched Ryan continue speaking with the manager near the rope separating the VIP section from the rest of the dining room. Naomi noticed that the surrounding guests had begun to sense the unusual energy in the room even if they did not know its cause, because conversations had grown quieter and several diners glanced curiously toward the entrance where Ryan stood. Victor finally lowered his voice and asked Naomi another question, this time not about Ryan but about her work at the restaurant. Naomi admitted that she worked evening shifts 5 nights a week and occasionally covered weekend lunches, walking nearly a mile from the subway station each night because it was the most affordable commute she could manage. She said that serving tables might not seem glamorous to people who dined there, but to her it represented stability and independence, something she had fought hard to reclaim. Victor studied her quietly as she spoke, and Naomi suddenly realized how unusual it felt to explain pieces of her life to someone she had met only minutes earlier beneath a restaurant tablecloth. Meanwhile, Ryan's voice rose again near the rope as he insisted that he knew Naomi worked there because someone had told him, and the manager responded with careful professionalism that employees were currently busy assisting guests and would not be available for personal conversations during service hours. The exchange drew more attention from nearby tables, and Naomi felt her pulse quicken because she understood that Ryan's determination rarely faded once he believed he was close to finding her. Beneath the table the space felt smaller with every passing second, yet Victor Castellano remained composed, observing the entire scene with the calm patience of someone who had spent many years watching how people behaved under pressure. When he finally looked down at Naomi again, his expression held a quiet certainty that made the noise of the restaurant seem distant, and for the first time since she had hidden beneath the table Naomi sensed that the moment unfolding around them might soon change direction in a way neither she nor Ryan had expected. Ryan Hale finally stepped past the velvet rope, ignoring the polite resistance in the manager's voice, and the moment he crossed into the VIP section the energy in Morello's shifted in a way that even the soft piano music could not soften. Several nearby guests lowered their voices or turned their attention back to their plates, pretending not to notice the tension unfolding only a few yards away while the polished crystal glasses on the tables reflected the warm chandelier light like tiny, quiet witnesses. Beneath the linen tablecloth, Naomi Brooks felt her pulse jump as she heard Ryan's footsteps approaching across the marble floor, each step measured and certain as if he already believed he was close to finding what he had come for. She pressed her back lightly against the chair leg beside her, trying to remain perfectly still while the space beneath the table seemed to grow smaller with every second. Above her, Victor Castellano remained composed, his posture relaxed in the same way it had been since the beginning of the evening, yet Naomi sensed a quiet alertness in him that made the surrounding noise of the restaurant feel distant and controlled. Ryan paused a few tables away and scanned the VIP section slowly, his eyes moving from guest to guest with a focused determination that caused the manager to speak again in a careful tone, reminding him that the area was reserved and asking if he would prefer to wait near the entrance while staff checked on the person he was looking for. Ryan answered with impatience that he knew exactly where she worked and that he only needed a moment to talk with her, insisting that the conversation would be quick and harmless. Naomi knew those words well enough to recognize the tone behind them, a tone that once sounded reassuring but now only made her stomach tighten. She remembered how Ryan used to speak that way months ago when their relationship first began, confident and persuasive in a way that made people believe he always meant well. The memory drifted through her mind like a faded photograph of another life, a time when evenings felt simple and she believed the future could be planned one small step at a time. But those days had slowly changed as Ryan's attention became heavier, more demanding, until even ordinary choices such as where she worked or which friends she spent time with became subjects he believed he had the right to question. Leaving him had not happened in a single dramatic moment but rather through a quiet realization that her life felt smaller each day she stayed, and the decision to walk away had been followed by months of rebuilding routines that belonged only to her. Morello's had become part of that quiet rebuilding, a place where the rhythm of serving tables and greeting guests allowed her to focus on the present instead of the past. Yet now the past had walked straight through the front door and was standing only a few steps away from the table where she hid. Ryan continued moving deeper into the VIP section, glancing beneath nearby tables and around the tall plants that separated the seating area, his frustration growing more visible each time he failed to find her. The manager hovered nearby with professional patience while several servers exchanged uncertain looks, unsure whether they should intervene or simply continue working as if nothing unusual was happening. Victor Castellano watched the scene unfold with the quiet focus of someone observing a chessboard rather than a restaurant dining room, his eyes following Ryan's movement with calm precision while Naomi beneath the table struggled to steady her breathing. She whispered softly that she would slip away the moment Ryan turned back toward the entrance because she did not want to create a disturbance that might damage the restaurant's reputation or interrupt the evening for guests who had come there expecting peace and elegance. Victor listened without answering immediately, his gaze lifting briefly toward the dining room before returning to the small hidden space beneath the table where Naomi crouched. From the way he studied the situation, Naomi realized that he was not simply a diner caught in an awkward moment, but someone accustomed to weighing decisions carefully before acting. Ryan's footsteps grew closer again, now only a few feet away, and Naomi could see the shadow of his shoes through the soft glow reflecting off the marble floor. The air seemed to pause with him as he stopped near the table where Victor sat, glancing around the VIP section one more time as if measuring every possibility before giving up. Beneath the linen cloth, Naomi held her breath while Victor Castellano rested one hand lightly against the edge of the table, his calm presence unchanged even as the tension in the room quietly reached its highest point. Ryan Hale stood only a few feet from the table now, and the closer he moved the more Naomi Brooks felt the quiet space beneath the linen cloth tighten around her like a small fragile shelter that might disappear at any moment. From where she crouched she could see the polished black leather of Ryan's shoes stop near the edge of the marble tile, the faint reflection of chandelier light stretching across the floor beside them, and she knew that if he took only one more step and looked down, the illusion of safety would vanish instantly. Above her, Victor Castellano remained seated with a calm stillness that seemed almost out of place in a moment filled with such tension, his fingers resting lightly against the table as if the evening were unfolding exactly as he expected. The restaurant manager continued speaking with practiced patience, reminding Ryan that Morello's maintained a quiet environment for its guests and suggesting again that he wait near the entrance while staff checked on the employee he wished to speak with. But Ryan's voice carried through the room with a firmness that made several diners glance up from their meals. He insisted that he knew Naomi worked there and that he had every right to speak with someone he once knew, explaining that he had been trying to find her for weeks and that this conversation would be simple if she would only come out and talk with him. Naomi closed her eyes briefly because the words sounded reasonable to anyone who did not understand the history behind them, and that was always how Ryan had spoken when others were listening, calm and confident in a way that made it difficult for strangers to imagine why someone might wish to avoid him. The truth, however, lived quietly inside Naomi's memory like a series of small warning signs she had once ignored until they became impossible to overlook. She remembered the early days when Ryan had seemed charming and attentive, bringing coffee to her workplace during lunch breaks and insisting on walking her home through the busy streets of Queens because he said the city could be unpredictable at night. At the time those gestures felt thoughtful, even protective, and Naomi had believed she had found someone who understood her determination to build a stable life in a city that often felt overwhelming, but over time the attention had slowly changed shape, turning into questions about where she spent her time, who she spoke with after work, and why she sometimes preferred quiet evenings alone rather than meeting him whenever he suggested. Those questions had gradually become expectations, and those expectations eventually turned into pressure that made her feel as though the space around her life was shrinking day by day. Leaving had not been easy, yet the moment she finally stepped away she had felt a quiet sense of relief, as if the world had opened again and allowed her to breathe fully for the first time in months. That was why the routine of working at Morello's meant so much to her, because every shift reminded her that she had rebuilt something steady and independent. Yet now the past stood only a few feet away from the table where she hid, searching the room with growing frustration while the manager continued trying to maintain the calm atmosphere expected by the restaurant's guests. Victor Castellano watched Ryan carefully during this exchange, his gaze steady and observant, as though he were studying not only the man's words but also the subtle shifts in his posture and tone. Naomi sensed that Victor understood the situation more clearly with each passing second even though she had only explained a small part of it. Ryan stepped slightly closer to the table and glanced toward the surrounding seating area again, his attention lingering briefly on the linen cloth that hung almost to the floor, and Naomi's heart pounded so loudly she feared it might be heard beyond the quiet space beneath the table. The air in the restaurant seemed to pause with him as the piano melody softened into a gentle chord and several diners looked away politely, pretending to focus on their plates rather than the tension unfolding nearby. Above her Victor Castellano shifted his hand slightly on the table and leaned back just enough to observe Ryan directly, his expression composed yet thoughtful. And in that moment Naomi realized that the evening had reached a quiet turning point where a single word from the man above her could change everything about what happened next. Ryan Hale shifted his weight slightly beside the table, the polished marble floor reflecting the movement of his shoes as the quiet tension in Morello seemed to settle into a fragile stillness that no one in the dining room wanted to disturb. Naomi Brooks remained crouched beneath the linen tablecloth with her hands pressed lightly against her knees, her breathing careful and controlled while she listened to every sound above her, aware that a single glance beneath the table would reveal her. Immediately, the restaurant continued its elegant rhythm around them with soft piano chords drifting through the warm light of the chandeliers, waiters moving carefully between tables, and guests speaking in low voices that suggested polite curiosity about the unusual interruption unfolding nearby. Ryan glanced around the VIP section once more, his expression tightening as the manager again explained that employees were currently assisting other guests and could not leave their stations during service hours. Ryan answered that he understood the rules but insisted that the woman he was looking for needed to speak with him because he had something important to say and because he had already spent weeks trying to find where she worked. Beneath the table Naomi closed her eyes briefly as the words reached her, knowing that Ryan's idea of an important conversation often meant a long attempt to persuade her that the past should not remain in the past. She had heard those explanations before. During the weeks after she left, when he called her phone repeatedly and asked mutual friends if they had seen her, always insisting that if she would simply listen for a few minutes everything could be resolved. Naomi had learned that the easiest way to protect her new life was to avoid those conversations entirely, because every discussion seemed to circle back to the same point where Ryan believed persistence alone should be enough to reopen a door she had already closed. Above her Victor Castellano remained still, observing the exchange with the quiet attention of someone who understood that the atmosphere of a room could change quickly once patience began. To fade, his eyes moved from Ryan to the manager and then briefly down toward the edge of the tablecloth where Naomi remained hidden, and although he did not speak immediately, Naomi sensed that he had already decided how the situation would end. Ryan stepped closer to the table and rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair as he looked around again, his gaze sweeping the nearby seating area with growing frustration, while several guests lowered their eyes to their plates to avoid being drawn into the moment. The restaurant manager offered a final suggestion that perhaps Ryan could leave a message and return another evening when staff were not so busy, but Ryan shook his head and replied that he would rather handle the matter now because he knew Naomi was somewhere inside the building and he did not plan to leave until he spoke with her. The words hung in the air for a moment, causing a few diners to exchange uncertain glances, while the piano player continued his gentle melody. Without interruption, beneath the table, Naomi felt the weight of the situation pressing closer around her and wondered how much longer she could remain unseen while Ryan searched the room. She whispered softly that she would slip out through the kitchen the moment Ryan moved away from the VIP section because she did not want the restaurant to suffer any trouble on her account, but Victor Castellano did not respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair and allowed his gaze to settled directly on Ryan Hale for the first time since the man had stepped into the VIP section. The calm focus in Victor's expression carried a quiet authority that seemed to steady the surrounding air, and although Ryan had not yet noticed the shift, Naomi sensed that the moment had arrived when the balance of the evening would begin to change. Victor lifted his hand slightly from the table as though preparing to speak, and beneath the linen cloth, Naomi realized that the next words spoken in that room would decide whether she remained a hidden observer or became the center of attention once again. Victor Castellano finally spoke, and his voice was calm enough that at first it seemed to blend with the soft piano melody drifting across Morello's dining room, yet the quiet authority in his tone carried farther than anyone expected. He simply said that the gentleman standing beside the table appeared to be looking for someone who did not wish to be found at the moment. And the words caused Ryan Hale to pause and turn his attention for the first time toward the man seated at the center table of the VIP section. Until that moment Ryan had been focused entirely on scanning the room, but now he studied Victor with the quick assessment of someone trying to determine whether he had just interrupted an ordinary guest or someone whose presence carried more significance. The chandeliers reflected warm light across the polished marble floor as nearby diners lowered their voices again. Sensing that the quiet tension in the room had shifted direction, beneath the linen tablecloth Naomi Brooks remained perfectly still, every sense sharpened as she listened to the exchange above her, aware that Victor's words had placed a new focus on the table where she hid. Ryan answered after a moment that he was not trying to cause trouble and that he simply needed to speak with someone who worked at the restaurant, explaining that he believed she might be nearby and that he had every intention of leaving peacefully once the conversation was finished. Victor listened with the composed patience of someone who rarely hurried his decisions, and when he replied his voice remained even and thoughtful as he observed that the evening had been quiet until Ryan entered the VIP section searching for someone who clearly preferred not to be part of the scene unfolding in front of the guests. The manager standing nearby looked relieved that someone had spoken calmly enough to slow the situation, and several diners glanced curiously toward Victor as if beginning to recognize the subtle shift in authority taking place. Ryan frowned slightly and asked if the man at the table knew where Naomi was, because he had already been told that she worked at Morello's and he did not intend to leave without at least confirming that she was all right. The question hovered in the air for a moment while Victor studied Ryan's expression carefully, measuring the tone behind his words rather than the words themselves. Beneath the table Naomi felt her pulse quicken again because she realized that Victor could easily reveal her hiding place with a single sentence, and although he had shown no intention of doing so, she understood that the choice now belonged entirely to him. Victor leaned back slightly in his chair and rested one hand against the table as though considering how much the evening's calm atmosphere was worth protecting, and then he answered that if the woman Ryan was searching for truly wished to speak with him she would most likely have appeared already rather than remain somewhere unseen. Ryan hesitated as the comment settled in his mind, glancing briefly around the dining room again while several guests pretended to focus on their meals even though their attention had clearly shifted toward the quiet conversation in the VIP section. Naomi could feel the subtle tension between the two men growing clearer with each exchange. not through raised voices or sudden movement but through the steady confidence that surrounded Victor's presence and the impatience that lingered in Ryan's posture. The piano player continued his soft melody without interruption while waiters moved carefully between tables, attempting to preserve the elegant rhythm expected in a restaurant like Morello's. Ryan finally stepped a little closer to Victor's table and said that he respected the restaurant's atmosphere but that he needed to know whether Naomi was inside the building because he had something important to tell her, something he believed she deserved to hear. Victor's eyes remained calm as he watched Ryan speak, and after a moment he responded that sometimes the most respectful thing a person could do was allow someone else the space to decide when a conversation should happen. The words carried a quiet certainty that caused the manager to shift his stance slightly, recognizing that the tone of the room now followed Victor rather than the visitor who had walked in uninvited. Beneath the linen cloth, Naomi realized that the balance of the evening had fully changed and that the man whose table she had chosen by accident had now become the quiet center of everything unfolding around them. Ryan Hale looked at Victor Castellano for a long moment after those words were spoken, and the silence that followed seemed to ripple outward through Morello's dining room like a quiet wave across still water. The soft piano music continued near the bar, yet several guests had slowed their conversations just enough to listen without appearing obvious, because the tone of the exchange had changed in a way that made the entire room feel more attentive. Ryan folded his arms and said that he was not trying to disrespect anyone and that he simply believed Naomi Brooks deserved the chance to hear what he had come to say, explaining that sometimes misunderstandings lasted longer than they should and that he wanted the opportunity to clear things up. Beneath the table, Naomi closed her eyes again because she had heard that explanation many times before, always spoken with the same careful calm that made strangers believe the story was simple, even though the truth behind it was far more complicated than a single conversation could resolve. Victor listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful as if weighing not only Ryan's words but the atmosphere of the entire restaurant around them, the quiet elegance that Morello's guests expected when they chose to dine there on a Friday evening. The manager stood nearby with polite patience, grateful that the conversation remained calm even as the tension lingered like a thin thread stretched across the room. Victor finally responded that the restaurant was not the right place to settle personal matters, especially when the person being discussed had clearly chosen not to step forward. His voice remained steady and unhurried, carrying the kind of quiet certainty that made the surrounding air feel more settled. Ryan glanced around the VIP section again and said that he understood the point, yet he insisted that Naomi might simply be avoiding him because she believed he would not listen to her concerns, and he wanted her to know that he had changed and that he only needed a few minutes to explain. Beneath the table, Naomi felt the words land heavily in her chest, not because she believed them, but because hearing them again reminded her how determined Ryan could be when he believed persistence alone would eventually open a closed door. She pressed her hands together to steady herself and listened as Victor answered that sometimes change was best demonstrated quietly rather than announced in front of a room full of strangers. The comment was delivered gently enough that it did not sound like criticism, yet the meaning settled clearly in the air between the two men. Ryan shifted his stance slightly and rested one hand against the back of a nearby chair while considering the response, and for the first time he seemed to study Victor more carefully as if realizing that the man he was speaking with carried a calm authority that did not belong to an ordinary guest. The chandeliers reflected softly across the marble floor while waiters moved cautiously through the dining room, doing their best to maintain the graceful rhythm expected by the restaurant's patrons. Beneath the linen tablecloth, Naomi could sense the attention of the room gathering around the quiet conversation above her even though most guests pretended to focus on their meals. Victor finally leaned forward slightly and rested his hands on the table in front of him, his gaze steady as he addressed Ryan once more. He said that if Naomi truly wished to hear what Ryan had come to say, she would find the moment and the place to do so on her own terms, and that pursuing her through the restaurant during a busy dinner service would only make the situation more uncomfortable for everyone involved. The words carried the calm confidence of someone accustomed to guiding difficult moments toward quieter endings. Ryan exhaled slowly and looked toward the entrance again as if considering whether continuing the search was worth the growing attention it was attracting. Beneath the table, Naomi realized that the entire evening now balanced on the choice Ryan would make next, and the quiet presence of Victor Castellano above her remained as steady as the soft music drifting through the warm light of Morello's chandeliers. Ryan Hale remained standing beside the table for several long seconds after Victor Castellano finished speaking, and the quiet stillness that followed seemed to settle across Morelos like a thin layer of glass over water. The piano player near the bar continued a gentle melody while waiters moved carefully between tables, though their usual rhythm had slowed just enough to reveal how closely the room was listening. Ryan finally exhaled and ran a hand through his hair before saying that he understood the point being made and that he did not wish to disturb anyone's evening, yet he could not simply walk away without knowing whether Naomi Brooks was safe and doing well. Beneath the linen tablecloth, Naomi felt the words echo through her chest with an uncomfortable familiarity because Ryan had always spoken with that same careful tone when he believed he was being reasonable. To strangers the statement might have sounded thoughtful, even considerate, yet Naomi knew how easily that calm voice could disguise the determination behind it. Victor watched Ryan with the composed patience that had defined his presence since the moment Naomi hid beneath the table, and when he spoke again his voice carried the same steady calm that had gradually shifted the atmosphere of the entire dining room. He observed that concern for someone's well-being was most meaningful when it respected the boundaries that person had chosen, and he added that pursuing Naomi through a crowded restaurant might not send the message Ryan believed it would. Ryan hesitated after hearing that, glancing toward the entrance as if weighing whether continuing the search would bring him any closer to the answer he wanted. Several guests returned their attention to their plates, sensing that the confrontation might be fading into something quieter. Though the tension had not completely disappeared, Naomi remained still beneath the table, aware that every decision made above her could change the course of the evening, and she wondered if Ryan would finally accept that the moment he hoped for would not happen tonight. The restaurant manager stood nearby with careful patience, relieved that the exchange had remained calm but clearly eager for the evening to return to its normal elegance. Ryan looked back toward Victor and said that perhaps the man was right about the setting, yet he insisted that his intentions were sincere and that Naomi deserved to hear him explain what he had been trying to say for months. Victor listened without interrupting and then responded that sincerity often revealed itself through patience rather than persistence, suggesting that if Ryan truly wished to repair what had been broken he might begin by giving Naomi the space she had clearly chosen. The comment was delivered with quiet confidence, neither confrontational nor dismissive, yet its meaning settled firmly in the air between them. Ryan studied Victor for a moment longer as if recognizing that continuing the conversation might only deepen the attention already gathering around them, and the soft glow of the chandeliers reflected across the marble floor while the piano melody drifted through the room once more. Beneath the table Naomi realized that the balance of the evening had shifted again, not through raised voices or dramatic gestures but through the calm authority that surrounded Victor Castellano's presence. Ryan finally nodded slightly and said that perhaps tonight was not the right time after all, adding that if Naomi wished to speak with him she knew how to reach him. With that he stepped back from the table and turned toward the velvet rope separating the VIP section from the rest of the dining room. The movement caused several guests to relax almost visibly as the tension began to dissolve. Naomi remained motionless beneath the table as Ryan's footsteps moved away across the marble floor, and above her Victor Castellano stayed seated with the same quiet composure he had held all evening, as if the unfolding scene had simply been another moment in a long series of decisions where patience had proven more powerful than urgency. Ryan Hale's footsteps faded gradually across the marble floor as he walked back toward the entrance of Morelos, and the quiet tension that had filled the dining room began to dissolve like mist under warm light. The piano player near the bar continued his gentle melody while conversations slowly resumed at nearby tables, diners returning their attention to their plates with the subtle relief that comes when an uncomfortable moment passes without turning into something worse. The manager released a quiet breath and thanked Ryan politely for understanding the restaurant's atmosphere, guiding him toward the door with professional calm before the front entrance finally closed behind him and the outside city noise disappeared once again. Beneath the linen tablecloth Naomi Brooks remained completely still for several seconds longer, listening carefully to the rhythm of the room as it returned to normal. The soft clink of silverware against porcelain plates and the low murmur of evening conversations drifting back into place. Above her Victor Castellano had not moved from his seat, his posture relaxed as if the unusual interruption had never disturbed the quiet dinner he had been enjoying. Naomi finally allowed herself to breathe more deeply and whispered that she believed he had left, her voice barely louder than the soft music echoing through the dining room. Victor glanced briefly toward the entrance before responding that the man had indeed walked out of the restaurant and that the staff would likely keep an eye on the front door for a while just in case he decided to return. Naomi nodded even though he could not fully see her beneath the tablecloth and said that she would slip away through the kitchen as quickly as possible because she did not want to create any more attention than she already had. Victor leaned slightly forward and lifted the edge of the linen cloth just enough to look beneath the table, his expression calm but thoughtful as he observed the young waitress crouched on the marble floor. He said quietly that hiding under a table during dinner service was not a usual part of the job description, though he understood why she had chosen the nearest place that offered cover. Naomi felt a faint, embarrassed smile touch her face and admitted that she had not planned the decision very carefully, explaining that when she heard Ryan's voice her first instinct had simply been to disappear before he noticed her. Victor studied her for a moment with the calm curiosity of someone who had watched many unexpected moments unfold during his life and replied that instincts often reveal more truth than careful planning. Naomi slowly shifted her position and pushed the linen cloth aside just enough to crawl out from beneath the table, brushing invisible dust from her apron as she stood upright beside the chair. The warm chandelier light reflected softly against the polished marble floor while the elegant rhythm of the restaurant continued around them, though a few nearby diners still glanced curiously toward the VIP table where the unusual scene had taken place. Naomi lowered her voice and thanked Victor sincerely for not revealing her hiding place, explaining that his quiet intervention had allowed the situation to end without embarrassment for the restaurant or for herself. Victor listened with the same calm composure that had guided the entire evening and replied that sometimes the easiest way to help someone was simply to remain patient long enough for a problem to solve itself. Naomi nodded thoughtfully and admitted that patience had not always been easy for her to learn, especially during the months when she was trying to rebuild her life after leaving a relationship that no longer felt healthy. Victor regarded her with quiet understanding and said that rebuilding anything meaningful often required more courage than people realized. For a brief moment neither of them spoke as the soft piano music drifted through the warm glow of Morello's chandeliers, and Naomi realized that the stranger whose table she had chosen by accident had not only protected her privacy but had also shifted the entire direction of the evening with nothing more than calm words and steady presence. Naomi Brooks remained standing beside Victor Castellano's table for a moment longer than she intended, aware that the restaurant around them had already returned to its graceful evening rhythm while she still felt the quiet echo of what had just happened settling in her thoughts. The chandeliers cast warm reflections across the polished marble floor, and the gentle piano music near the bar continued as though the unusual interruption had been nothing more than a brief pause in an otherwise elegant night. Naomi adjusted the edge of her apron and glanced toward the entrance again, confirming that Ryan Hale had indeed disappeared from sight beyond the front doors of Morello's, and with that realization she felt a small wave of relief settle into her shoulders. She turned back toward Victor and repeated her thanks with more steadiness in her voice, explaining that the last thing she had wanted was to cause attention inside a place where she worked hard to keep everything running smoothly for the guests. Victor listened with the same composed expression that had guided the entire evening and said quietly that restaurants often saw unexpected moments because life rarely followed a predictable script, yet how people handled those moments mattered far more than the interruption itself. Naomi nodded thoughtfully and admitted that tonight had reminded her how quickly the past could appear when she least expected it. She explained that she had spent many months building a quieter routine for herself after leaving the relationship that Ryan had tried to reopen again this evening, and that working at Morello's had given her a sense of stability she had not realized she needed until she finally found it. Victor regarded her with calm attention as she spoke, his expression reflecting the patient curiosity of someone accustomed to listening before drawing conclusions. He observed that rebuilding a life after a difficult chapter required a certain kind of determination, the sort that did not always receive recognition from the outside world. Naomi felt a faint smile return at those words because it had been a long time since anyone described her efforts with that level of understanding. Around them the dining room continued its quiet elegance as waiters carried plates between tables and guests resumed their conversations. The earlier tension now reduced to little more than a memory shared by a few curious observers. The manager passed by briefly and gave Naomi a quick reassuring nod, grateful that the situation had ended calmly and that the evening service could continue without disruption. Naomi thanked Victor once more and said that she should probably return to her duties before another table needed assistance, because Morello's was known for attentive service and she did not want the guests to feel neglected. Victor inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement and replied that responsibility often revealed a person's character more clearly than words ever could. Naomi stepped back from the table and began to move toward the service station, yet after only a few steps she paused and turned back again, realizing that the man who had helped restore calm to the entire room was still sitting quietly as if the evening belonged to him alone. She asked if there was anything he needed before she returned to work, perhaps another glass of water or a recommendation from the dessert menu. Victor allowed a small thoughtful smile to appear and answered that he would appreciate whatever dessert the staff usually recommended to guests who had endured an unexpectedly long evening. Naomi laughed softly at that description and said that the house favorite was a warm chocolate soufflé served with vanilla bean cream, which many regular diners claimed was worth returning for even after a complicated day. Victor said that sounded perfect and thanked her. Naomi nodded once more before finally turning back toward the service area, her steps steadier now as she rejoined the quiet rhythm of trays, menus, and candlelit tables. Yet as she moved through the dining room she carried with her the awareness that the calm voice from the VIP table had not only protected her privacy, but had also reminded her that sometimes the right person appearing at the right moment could change the direction of an entire evening without raising their voice at all. The rhythm of Morello's dining room settled back into its familiar balance as Naomi Brooks returned to the service station and lifted a polished silver tray from the counter. Yet even while she resumed the small precise movements that defined her work she could still feel the quiet echo of the evening's tension lingering beneath the calm surface of the restaurant. The warm glow from the chandeliers reflected across rows of crystal glasses while guests spoke softly over candlelit tables, unaware that only minutes earlier the room had held a moment delicate enough to change the direction of someone's life. Naomi moved through the aisles with practiced ease, delivering a bottle of sparkling water to one table and clearing empty plates from another, allowing the steady routine to restore the confidence that had been shaken when Ryan Hale walked through the door. Yet each time she passed the VIP section, she felt a brief awareness of the table where Victor Castellano still sat quietly, the calm center of the evening who had shifted the entire atmosphere with nothing more than measured words and steady presence. When the kitchen bell rang softly she collected the warm chocolate soufflé she had recommended earlier, its delicate aroma rising above the gentle scent of espresso and baked bread that filled the air near the service counter. She carried the dessert carefully through the dining room and placed it in front of Victor with a small smile, explaining that the chef always prepared the soufflé fresh so the center remained warm and light. Victor thanked her and glanced at the dessert with quiet appreciation before looking up again with the thoughtful expression that had never quite left his face during the evening. He observed that the restaurant seemed to have returned to its usual calm, and Naomi nodded while admitting that Morello's rarely experienced unexpected interruptions, because most guests came there precisely for the peaceful atmosphere. She added that tonight had reminded her how unpredictable life could be even in the most carefully arranged settings. Victor listened with interest and asked how long she had worked at the restaurant, and Naomi explained that it had been almost a year since she first started the job, adding that she had learned more about patience and professionalism during those months than she ever expected when she first carried a tray across the dining room floor. Victor remarked that restaurants were often a reflection of the people who worked in them, because a calm environment usually depended on individuals who knew how to handle difficult moments without losing their composure. Naomi felt a quiet sense of pride at those words because maintaining that calm was something the staff took seriously every night. Around them the restaurant continued its gentle flow of conversation and music while the earlier tension faded into memory. The manager passed the table again and offered Victor a brief nod of gratitude, clearly aware that the evening might have unfolded very differently if the situation had not been handled with such restraint. Naomi remained beside the table for a moment longer, aware that she should return to the service station but also sensing that the conversation had not quite finished. Victor looked toward the entrance of the restaurant where Ryan had disappeared earlier and then back at Naomi, saying that sometimes the hardest decision for people to accept was that not every conversation needed to happen immediately. Naomi considered that thought and admitted that learning to walk away from certain situations had been one of the most important lessons of the past year. Victor nodded slowly and said that patience often created opportunities that force never could. Naomi thanked him once again. This time not only for keeping her secret beneath the table but also for reminding her that calm confidence could sometimes protect more effectively than confrontation. The soft piano melody continued drifting across the room as she finally stepped away from the VIP table and returned to the quiet rhythm of trays, menus, and candlelit conversations, carrying with her the growing realization that the unexpected encounter beneath that table might remain one of the most important moments she would remember long after the evening ended. The evening at Morello's moved gently toward its final hours as the steady rhythm of dinner service softened into the quieter pace that came just before closing time, when most guests had finished their meals and the restaurant glowed with the calm satisfaction of a night that had returned to balance. Naomi Brooks carried a tray of empty glasses back to the service station and paused for a moment near the kitchen doorway, allowing herself to take a slow breath while the warm scent of coffee and fresh pastry drifted through the air. The events of the evening replayed quietly in her mind, not as a moment of fear anymore but as a reminder of how quickly a person's past could appear without warning and how equally quickly the right voice could restore calm. Across the dining room, Victor Castellano finished the last spoonful of the chocolate soufflé she had recommended earlier, setting the small porcelain dish aside while the candlelight reflected softly across the polished surface of the table. He remained seated for a few moments longer as if appreciating the quiet atmosphere of the restaurant, the piano melody now slower and softer as the musician prepared to end the final set of the night. Naomi stepped away from the service station and approached the VIP table once more, asking politely whether everything had been satisfactory. Victor nodded and said that the dessert had been exactly as good as she promised, adding that evenings often revealed more about a place than the food alone could ever show. Naomi understood what he meant and replied that Morello's had always tried to create a space where people could enjoy a peaceful moment in the middle of a busy city. Victor stood slowly from the table, placing his jacket over his shoulders with the same quiet composure he had carried throughout the evening, and for a brief second Naomi noticed how naturally the room seemed to acknowledge his presence even though most guests did not openly stare. He thanked her again for the recommendation and for the professionalism she had shown during a situation that might have unsettled many people. Naomi smiled and answered that the restaurant's training encouraged staff to remain calm under pressure, though she admitted that tonight she had relied more on instinct than training. Victor regarded her thoughtfully and said that instinct was often the most honest form of wisdom a person possessed. Naomi felt the weight of that comment settled gently in her thoughts as the manager approached with the bill folder, offering Victor a respectful nod while thanking him for visiting Morello's. Victor signed the receipt with a brief motion and then turned back toward Naomi before leaving. He said that every city contained moments where strangers crossed paths for reasons they did not understand at the time, yet sometimes those moments carried lessons that stayed with them long after the evening ended. Naomi listened carefully and replied,